very warm welcome to you all to this webinar hosted by the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center. We are based at the University of Colorado, Boulder. I'm Imtiaz Rangwala, co-hosting this webinar with my colleague Heather Yoakum. We bring you these webinars to facilitate a discussion of science, research, and best practices related to adaptation and resource management under a rapidly changing climate and other emerging challenges, with a focus on the north central US that encompasses the Missouri and the upper Colorado River basins. Before I introduce our speakers, a quick word on housekeeping. We are recording this webinar and you can find all our recordings on our website. During the webinar, all participants will be muted, but you will be able to unmute during the Q&A period at the end. We, however, encourage you to put your questions and comments in the chat anytime during the webinar, and we will start with those questions first during the Q&A. We will end the formal part of this webinar at noon Mountain Time and stop the recording at that point. After that, anyone who wishes to stay on to engage in a more informal conversation with our speakers is encouraged to do so. And now I'm delighted to introduce our speakers for today. First, we have our very own Dr. Brian Miller. Brian is a U.S. Geological Survey research ecologist with the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center. Brian focuses on developing and applying scenario planning, ecological simulation modeling, and related tools to help partners navigate climate change impacts and adaptation options. Brian has an interdisciplinary background studying human-environment interactions. He has a PhD in ecology from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Next, we have Dr. Gregor Skierman. Gregor is an ecologist with the National Park Service Climate Change Response Program. His work focuses on incorporating climate science into management and planning, producing and synthesizing management-relevant science, and developing climate change adaptation tools and concepts. He previously worked on TNE species conservation and climate change adaptation with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources and the USGS Pacific Island Ecosystem Research Center in Hawaii Volcanoes National Park. Gregor has a PhD from the University of Washington. And finally, we have Dr. Todd Jones-Farrand. Todd, as he goes by Green Todd, he's a science coordinator with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services Natural Resource Program Center. He leads the interdisciplinary science translation for Adaptation Resource Team, START, whose mission is to help the National Wildlife Refuge System meet its conservation mission by providing scientific information and decision support for adapting to rapidly changing social ecological conditions. Todd earned a PhD in wildlife ecology from the University of Missouri. The title for today's webinar is Organizing the Climate Adaptation Toolkit. A big thank you to all our speakers. And Brian, if you're ready, please take it away.
Yeah, thanks very much, Imtiaz, for the introductions, and warm welcome, and thanks also to Heather for helping organize the series. So hearing no objections, I take it folks can hear me okay and see the slide. And yeah, so you'll get to hear from three of us today. Hopefully that keeps it interesting and dynamic. But I will sort of right here at the top recognize that the ideas we're sharing are from a broader group of people who co-authored this paper, which came out during the shutdown. So particularly for you government employees, but for many others as well. This one could have flown under the radar a bit. But this author team, I just kind of want to acknowledge them for a couple of reasons. Partly that collectively, we represent two federal government departments, so Department of Interior and U.S. Department of Ag, as well as 5 bureaus under those. So USGS, National Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, Forest Service, and Bureau of Land Management. And for you cask enthusiasts, in addition to having 3 of us from North Central, myself, Aparna, Molly, we also had individuals from the Northwest and Southeast casks. Importantly, my colleagues on this one also brought a lot of their on-the-ground experience to the ideas that we generated here. A number of them have been doing work with managers and within management agencies for at least a decade. So collectively, we're talking about dozens of years of applied experience that we were able to draw on. So thanks to them for being part of the team. So the idea that initiated this paper, which was that we as a community of adaptation scientists and practitioners might benefit from a shared vision for climate-informed resource stewardship, it was based on this recognition in one of Gregor's papers from 2022 that, of course, our resource management partners are working in a very different world than the one in which most of their agencies and their traditions were formed. And the non-stationarity of climate change and associated ecological transformations put them in unfamiliar territory where the tools, assumptions, and things that we're using to guide management are increasingly insufficient for stewarding resources. I think the good news here is that in many ways, I'd say our broader collective field of climate change adaptation science has really risen to the occasion. I think over the past decades, we've produced or adapted a variety of planning processes and tools to address the challenge of anticipating and responding to climate change. And so now, as you can see just from this smattering of examples here, we have a bunch of tools and processes at our disposal to confront the challenge of climate change adaptation. And this expansion, this proliferation of tools and processes is, I think, a sort of a natural product of a relatively new and growing field, and one that's navigating this paradigm shift. And I think it's in some ways it's beneficial. We need multiple tools to address the various facets of the challenge, and we're working in a variety of institutional contexts that necessitate flexibility. But if you sort of find this array of processes and tools somewhat confusing or disorienting or even frustrating, you are not alone. I've shared those feelings at times, and that confusion is sort of raises a number of questions. So how do these processes, these circular diagrams, we see them all the time, how do they relate to each other? How do the tools that we talk about, RAD, scenario planning, and so forth, how do those relate to the processes and to each other? Can these things, these processes, these tools be used in complementary ways? If so, how do we do that? And I think this sort of expansion of tools, the questions now that have come along with that, maybe indicate kind of where we are on a broader trajectory as a field in terms of sort of coalescing around some shared idea of climate change adaptation and what it looks like. And this is a figure that's often used in participatory processes to kind of illustrate how folks, the sort of the mode of their participation evolves through time. So, a group might start on the left side of the figure by collectively identifying a problem that's guiding their participation or on some work. And over time, the number of perspectives and ideas and opinions sort of expands. They diverge, and this is good. We want that creativity. Then you have to work your way through the groan zone in the middle, where there's so many it can feel overwhelming, towards some sense of convergence and even maybe closure around a smaller set of refinements and consolidated thinking, and ultimately maybe a solution. Now, I think that we can think of the arc of climate change adaptation science maybe flowing through an analogous kind of process. Now, I don't mean to suggest that we are at or even will arrive at a single solution. I don't know that that's true, but I would like to think that as a field, we're maybe coming around into this convergent zone where we're maybe consolidating our thinking and refining it in productive ways. And I think it's important to arrive at some common understanding of how adaptation planning processes and tools fit together, in part just so that we can communicate with one another, whether that's as scientists, adaptation practitioners, managers, our partners, communicating with each other in a way that makes sense. We all share some understanding, is important because that allows us to coordinate efficiently and effectively, to further the research we're doing, the development, and even application. And I think particularly if we want to work across jurisdictions, then this shared understanding is really critical to our work. As a first sort of step toward that clarity, I think we need to do a little bit of clarification of terminology. I know, at least for me, this can be a part of a presentation where my eyes kind of glaze over. So I'll try to make it as painless as I can. Try to be quick. I want to focus in on 3 particular terms that I'm showing here on this slide: approach, planning process, and tool. And part of the reason I feel the need to do this, even though they might seem pretty straightforward or intuitive, is that I think we are seeing that some of these concepts have been either mixed or conflated, even in the literature. And so I kind of want to get us off on the right foot in this webinar today with some consistency. Starting with approach. And here what we mean when we say this is a general and flexible set of principles that guide us toward a particular purpose. And to maybe put a finer point on it, I'm going to use an analogy here from something that's well outside of my area of expertise, but maybe is clarifying. You could think about 3 fundamentally different approaches to building a structure or a home. There's sort of the traditional wood framing approach there on the left, but there's also prefabricated ways of putting together a home, and there's now this advent of 3D printing structures. And so we could think of these as they're all have the same goal. They all want to build a house, but they do it in sort of fundamentally different ways. They have different principles, they have different trade-offs, and I think we can see sort of a similar emergence of different approaches within the climate adaptation space as well. Sometimes emerging from different federal agencies, like in the upper left there is a Forest Service guidance document. The lower right is planning for a changing climate out of the National Park Service. Some are multi-agency teams like Climate Smart Conservation, and others have a more academic bent, like the ACT Adaptation for Conservation Targets framework shown there. Now, within each of these sort of broad approaches, there are particular processes or series of steps for developing and implementing a climate adaptation plan. And to carry forward our analogy here, for a traditional wood framing approach, one might articulate this sort of 6-step process for building the house, right? The process for home building for a prefabricated building, it maybe follows some similar steps, but also has some unique features to it. And then finally with 3D printing, similarly, you have sort of 5 to 6 steps for putting together a home. Clearly there are some unique features to the steps, but there's also shared features, right? All of them involve some foundation building. They all include some, putting on walls, putting up a roof of some sort, and finishing touches at the end. So we can start to see, there's differences. There's also commonalities, and we're realizing that in climate change adaptation, we're met with sort of a similar diversity of adaptation planning processes. These again are from the ACT framework in the upper left, Climate Smart Conservation in the middle and the top. The lower left is the adaptation workbook out of the Forest Service, and the lower right is planning for a changing climate out of Park Service. And there are others as well, of course, they all tend to follow sort of this circular or circular-ish um, kind of flow, and that's for good reason and intentional because they're all adaptive management based cycles whereby one can progress through the cycle and then come back to the beginning and revise what your goals are, what you're attempting to do based on new information. But to facilitate some comparison of these adaptation planning processes, we took each of them and laid them out linearly so that we can sort of really directly compare the steps in each one. And we're not showing all of the detail, of course, here in terms of how we might go backwards in some of these steps and reevaluate a preceding step. That's sort of inherent to all of them as well. But here we're, again, just to aid in comparison, making them clean and linear. And what we can see when we do that is that they're all quite compatible. The differences among them are relatively minor. Some lump or split steps differently. Some use slightly different verbiage, but they're all broadly consistent. And I should add that one thing we don't really talk about in the paper is that we also looked at planning processes from other sources, for example, Department of Defense, and arrived at the same conclusion. We just chose to include these four here in our paper because one of the co-authors was involved in one or more. So once we've kind of realized that there's this consistency, we could then easily identify the 7 common steps to all of them. And those are there at the top, the 7 steps that sort of cut across all 4 of the processes we evaluated. And we're going to kind of come back to and walk through those steps, so don't worry about kind of ingesting all of those right now. But what sort of the next, in my mind, question becomes then is, all right, great, so we have these high-level steps, that's fine, but how do we actually do them? What do we know about our ability to accomplish these steps? And of course, this is where our tools come in, the specific objects or methods for deriving or applying information. Again, I think pretty straightforward definition, something in terms of our analogy is pretty obvious, perhaps. A tool is a tool. But again, we're seeing that tools in some cases are being conflated with broader processes, or tools are expected to accomplish tasks that other things were designed to perform. So, in this home building analogy, we could have a favorite tool. We might even use that tool across multiple steps of building a home, but we don't really expect it to do all the steps or to do all the steps on its own. I might love hammers and use the hammer a lot in my home building process, but I need my other tools too as well, because of that, hammering isn't sort of synonymous with the home building process. We got to make space for our other important tools and processes within as well. So the final point I'll make here is just that much like these literal tools, within adaptation, we're also seeing sort of the emergence of classes of very similar tools. There's, for example, here with home building, there's different kinds of screwdrivers, there's different kinds of pliers, but they fundamentally are meant to accomplish the same task. They have slight differences that make them more suitable for particular applications, but we're seeing that in adaptation as well. With the proliferation of tools here, we see things like adaptation menus, scenario planning, resist, accept, direct, resistance, resilience, transition, this variety of tools emerging. And so, our challenge within this paper then was to articulate exactly where these fit within our planning process, the 7 steps that we've identified through our comparison of a variety of processes. So we took our 7 steps along the top there, made them circular one more time to again bring us back to the notion that this is an adaptive management based cycle, and also to facilitate the positioning of those tools along these 7 steps. And one more time, I'll also note that we don't include the backwards arrows in this diagram for sort of cleanliness and to keep things visibly or visually appealing, but just know that we do recognize that any step may require going back a step or two or three in some instances. So what we'll do now, I'm going to pass to Gregor, who's going to walk us through each of these steps and explain sort of how the tools fit. And I'll stop sharing and get his slides up.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Brian. Just pulling mine up here. Give me 1 second. Unless somebody tells me differently, it looks like it's working. So I'm going to get rolling and take us on a spin through the adaptation process cycle. And just a warning up front, this is going to get technical because we're getting into the nitty-gritty of which tools fit in which steps and how it all relates. And as Brian said, if you feel a little overwhelmed, that's okay. That's how we felt for years, many of us who've contributed to this paper. And bringing all these heads together really helped us find clarity that we didn't have at the beginning. And so jumping right in, the process begins with defining the scope. What is our focal resource? Is it a species, a natural community, or an ecosystem? As well as clarifying the spatial and temporal scales here. What's the spatial extent of our planning and how far into the future are we trying to plan? The other thing that this step one process begins with is clarifying the goals for our focal resource and also the means to achieve them, which are here referred to as objectives, but can also be called strategies and things like that. And developing this kind of clarity about what we're focusing on, what the current goals are for it, all of that sounds like good best practices, step one in natural resource management planning, and it is. But many adaptation planning efforts don't do this well enough at the outset and end up having to hit pause and circle back, which is certainly fine to do, but maybe not the most efficient way. Okay, I'm just going to get my slides advancing here. In terms of tools that support this first step, structured decision-making, which is shown at the bottom left here, is a key tool. And that's because in its first two steps, it does a lot of what step one in the adaptation process is trying to do. If you want to understand your problem, you have to understand your focus. And there in step two, well, what are the objectives for that focus? And in some ways, planning is a specific type of decision. So let's go around the SDM cycle for a second and just kind of show the crosswalk to the adaptation planning process. So if we jump now to step three, exploring alternatives in SDM, we see that overlaps with step four in the adaptation process, identify adaptation strategies. And as we move onward and we examine the consequences and the trade-offs and the optimizations associated with those potential strategies, that really maps onto the first half of step five in the adaptation planning process. And then as we move into that final step in structured decision-making, decide and take action, that completes step five in adaptation planning and step six. And that just leaves the adaptation planning process as step seven, monitoring evaluation, which closes the learning cycle. And so kind of seeing how these crosswalk and seeing that SDM is a complex tool, we refer to it as sort of a meta tool, where we're going to draw from it in multiple steps of the adaptation process. And, although it might seem complex, what I showed with crosswalking is one can actually do this quite easily. And the reason is because both of these processes are based on the same foundation of adaptive management. The final thing I want to point out before I move on is those recursive arrows in the structured decision-making process. You can imagine them also existing, as Brian said, in our process. They're just not shown. Okay, scenario planning would be a great thing, and it is an important tool for working with the uncertainty of climate change, but we cannot invoke it here in this first step because, as the figure at the top left shows, scenario planning requires clarity about your objectives. It requires that you bring that into the process. It doesn't have a step for it. But what we can bring in alongside structured decision-making is scenario-based decision analysis, which is another meta tool. And it combines elements of structured decision-making and scenario planning. And again, I'm going to try and stay out of the weeds a little bit, but just want to point out those black circles are steps straight out of structured decision-making. The white circles are steps out of scenario planning, and the gray circles are merged hybrid steps. Okay, so now we're stepping into step two, which is about understanding the implications of climate change for our focal resource. And implications are often negative, and so we refer to them as vulnerabilities, but there can be positive implications that are important to take note of and take advantage of. The output of this step is typically called a climate change vulnerability assessment, or a CCVA. And here we really can draw from climate change scenario planning, and in particular, steps 2, 3, and 4 of that cycle shown on the left map really well onto this vulnerability assessment step. The other thing more generally, when you bring in climate change scenario planning thinking, is that you're ensuring that this and other steps, where it's appropriate, really work with this irreducible uncertainty of climate change and how resources may respond to those changes, rather than ignoring that uncertainty just because it's challenging. And so what this means in practice is explicitly considering the range of ways in which climate change may play out and the range of ways in which the focal resource may respond. And again, a little bit scary here. It's a lot of technical stuff, but we're going to stay high level. The first point is that there are many ways to do a vulnerability assessment, from expert elicitation, consulting the literature, to very algorithm-driven assessments like the one shown at the bottom left, which is kind of the state-of-the-art VA for species, courtesy of NatureServe and the USGS. And in the same way that there are many ways to bring in, or many ways to do a climate change vulnerability assessment, there are many ways to do response modeling that can inform that vulnerability assessment, and that's an important tool. And on the right-hand side, what we're showing here is a conceptual model of how climate change and other influences may influence greater sage-grouse habitat. And that brings me to my next point, which is that we focus a lot on climate change here because it's highly consequential for resources, and there's a lot of uncertainty that has to be worked with. But depending on your planning context, you may also need to consider landscape level forces. Like, for instance, if you're interested in gaming out how a change in precipitation might affect flows in waterways, you also need to know if there are changes in impervious surfaces on your landscape. The other key thing to keep in mind is that individual climate features could yield different and overlapping ecological outcomes, as shown by this paper led by Kira Clark-Wolf. And the figure on the left basically shows the top four divergent climate futures, and then for each of them shown below is the ecological outcome. But that's a little bit simple, and so the figure at the bottom center of the slide kind of takes that next step and shows us that we can get more than one ecological outcome from a given climate trajectory, and that there can be some overlapping. And in the end, distilling the range of what might plausibly occur into a discrete and manageable set of divergent ecological outcomes is important not only for characterizing vulnerability in a way that works with this uncertainty, but also in subsequent steps in the process. So now we understand the implications of climate change for our focal resource. Now's the time to review and reconsider our management goals. And this is a distinct step rather than just a recursive arrow from step 2 back to step 1, because it's so important in the context of climate change, where so many of our historical goals and approaches are no longer effective. And this memo from the director of the National Park Service from over a dozen years ago kind of shows that that recognition has been around for a while, and that it's the pervasiveness of them and the magnitude of climate change that requires that we reconsider approaches that have been successful in the past. And climate change, therefore, means that historically achievable goals may no longer be achievable, or may require different means of achieving them. And this process of reviewing and reconsidering current goals can be enriched by the use of the RAD or its sister framework, the RRT framework, in just helping think about and encourage participants to think across the full decision space, from managing for change to managing for persistence. And I'll describe these tools in a minute and their relationship with each other, so just want to put a pin in that. So here's the potential outcomes of a goal review and a review of the means to achieve the goal, which here is called a strategy. It could be that the current goal continues to be achievable into the future with the current strategy, so business as usual gets a seal of approval. It could be that the current goal is still achievable in the future, but will require a revised strategy, and we call that a climate retrofit. Or it could be that we require a new goal because the current goal is not achievable with any feasible means, in which case we call this a climate rebuild, and it requires a new strategy as well. So now we're stepping into the fourth step, which is about identifying potential adaptation strategies. What might a manager do differently in light of the implications identified in step 2, and maybe the need to think more broadly flagged in step 3? And so the product of this process is what we generally call an adaptation menu. And it's typically a nested set of potential actions that help bridge from big ideas like reduce disturbance or engage the community to specific steps that a manager can take. And as in scenario-based decision analysis and structured decision making, this step is intentionally distinct from the next step of assessing and choosing, because once we get into that sort of analytical and logical mind frame, that can shut down some of the creativity that's important in just brainstorming out different and new ways to deal with new challenges. And again, we don't show recursive errors, but there's a lot of oscillating between steps 3 and 4 in practice. And the other thing, sort of calling out scenario-based decision analysis here as one of the tools, but also just scenario planning in general. This is a place to keep those different scenarios of climatic and ecological change in mind in developing strategies that address them. And in addition, RAD and RRT, again, can really help in fully operationalizing this step and fostering a diverse menu of options across that decision space from managing for persistence to managing for change. And again, I'll return to RAD and RRT in a minute. But before I do so, I just want to say that this step can begin with just a blank piece of paper, or it can begin with pre-prepared resource-specific adaptation menus that participants can then modify and expand before working with them. And in terms of these pre-prepared menus, the Northern Institute for Applied Climate Sciences and the U.S. Forest Service have really been leaders in this for years and published a slew of these menus. And here's their main adaptation menus page showing here, along with a little graphic that shows that what they call the content of these menus is options within which are nested strategies, approaches, and tactics. And members of this group and others created this climate adaptation menu for North American grasslands. And here's another one produced in conjunction with the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center. Okay, so let's talk about RAD and RRT. And I'm going to pick up Brian's house building analogy here and say that these are two very similar tools, kind of like a Phillips screwdriver and a flathead screwdriver. And both are intended to carry out a very similar particular function, but they're designed for specific, slightly different circumstances. So you'll use one or the other in the same way that you'll either use a Phillips or a flathead screwdriver, depending on the kind of screw you're using to put your house together. Okay, so not surprisingly, RAD and RRT kind of come from the same intellectual root, which is a paper by Connie Millar and colleagues from 2007. And in the same way that both screwdrivers in the previous slide are built for inserting a screw, RAD and RRT both foster thinking across the manager decision space, as I've said, from persistence to change. And as you see in the graphic on the top right, the Forest Service really uses both of these frameworks depending on the management approach for the area that's being focused on, whereas DOI bureaus generally use the RAD framework. Now, being precise and thoughtful about our language is important, as Inigo Montoya has pointed out. And this slide shows which key terms in these two tools really align or similar and where the differences are. And as we can see up top, both of them really span that range from resisting change to directing it. They use slightly different terminology. What's unique and different here is that RAD really recognizes acceptance of autonomous change as a conscious choice to be made. And that's really important on conservation lands, particularly in designated wilderness. There's also a bit of a difference in how resilience is treated. I think RAD thinking kind of assumes resilience is sort of a special case of resistance, whereas my perception is the Forest Service treats it as a little more of an intermediate step that can accept or can foster a certain amount of change, and so kind of blurs that distinction. And I would argue that maintaining that distinction as RAD does, again, is particularly useful on conservation lands where being clear about whether you're trying to keep historical patterns or something else is critical. The final point here is there's a nice USDA Climate Hub page devoted to looking at both of these frameworks, which can be useful. Okay, so now we're in step 5 of analyzing and selecting strategies. And this can be a simple sticky dot and discussion exercise among members of a tightly knit small management team, or it can be a much more involved and elaborate process where the decisions are more complex and maybe the participants are more numerous. And here, elements of structured decision-making, some of which are also found in scenario-based decision analysis, can be really important in providing that structure and the process for evaluating these options, looking at trade-offs and consequences, things like that. Response modeling, as it was important in step 2, becomes important again in helping us understand what we get if we apply a certain adaptation strategy. And so both of these figures on the left are doing that. The top one is for sockeye management. The bottom one is looking at risk of decline in a songbird population based on different assumptions of how climate will play out, plus different management approaches. Okay, having selected a strategy, the next step is implementation. And despite the graphic here, or you can see everybody's laughing, implementation is not easy. It's complex and complicated. And some adaptation processes don't get there. Sometimes that's a shortcoming, and sometimes that's the intention. Maybe going through the process was more to be exploratory and preliminary than to actually make a hard decision immediately and apply it. But where making and implementing a decision is the intention, that's largely in the hands of the participants, right? The managers and decision makers. But what a facilitator can do is involve activities in this step that really catalyze that action. And they could be like mapping out the specific actions required to apply a strategy, the sequence in which the actions will occur, who will be involved, how it will be funded, permitting and communication, and so on. And finally, step 7 is about monitoring and evaluation of the outcomes of those implemented strategies, which can then be used to modify the general approach. And so developing this knowledge and using it to adjust the management approach is, on the one hand, just good adaptive management. But on the other hand, it's particularly critical in the context of climate change, where climate is operating outside of historical bounds, and knowledge from and of the past has less and less utility. So this is my final slide before I hand on to Todd, who's going to bring us the key messages from the paper, kind of distill them down. But the good news is that monitoring and evaluation is not new. It's not something we need to invent. There are lots of approaches that can be leveraged, maybe modified slightly, to monitor and evaluate strategy effectiveness. And just sort of an example of a new approach that might be useful in this context is the Bureau of Land Management's streamlined resource assessment, which brings together data from the field with remotely sourced data, different spatial scales, all of that in one file with some interpretation to support management decisions. So with that, I'm going to keep driving, but put myself on mute and drive for Todd.
Thanks, Gregor. So I'm gonna take this home, and we're gonna start with key messages. And so the first one out of the paper is really that we don't need really to be, excuse me, reinventing the adaptation planning wheel, right? We've looked across these. There's a lot of commonalities. As Brian said, we've looked at other ones that aren't in the paper, and that consistency is true there. So we really feel like we're coming out of that grown zone, and that by lining them up together and kind of showing how they interact, we can help with that clearer communication. Next. This is the second message is kind of summarized by don't get wrapped around the axle. We think that can happen when you're not clear or you're blurring the lines between approaches, processes, and tools. And we're still seeing that in some places. We also think that the tools that are available, there's a lot of them, and they have good established places in the process. They can be complementary or even interchangeable. So we don't need to be too parochial about the tools. Next. So I'm going to move from like the paper itself to talk about more practical applications. And the first point I want to make is that adaptation is a social process, right? There's things that have to happen before, during, and after that we don't really cover in the paper. And there are good tools for that, like stakeholder analysis to figure out who needs to be at the table having these conversations, communication tools before, during, and after to make sure we're being clear about what we're doing and why. And then associated with that is this idea that the coin of the realm is capacity. Because it's a social process, we need to be, when we're engaging in it, we need to be thinking about the time we're investing, the people, talent we're investing, the funding or treasure that we're investing, but also the trust, because how you handle this process can derail the process if you're not building trust as you go. Next. With that in mind, one of the things that I think we recognize as the authors of this is that you can choose any one of these processes. You don't have to choose the 7 steps that, as we laid it out. If you're working in the MPS, they use P4CC, or planning for a changing climate, and MPS folks are familiar with that. So don't try to teach them something new. But if you're working cross agencies, or you're working in a partnership, then it's probably a good idea to, at least at the beginning, show the commonalities between those planning cycles and maybe even focus on the 7 steps as we've laid them out. Next. Associated with that is this idea that the tools match up to steps in the process. So regardless of which process you use, we think the flower figure that Gregor walked us through is really useful for helping figure out which tool you should be using at which step in the process. And going back to the social idea of capacity there, these tools are pretty complementary or even interchangeable. So choose the tool that works for your decision maker and your stakeholders. Next. So I want to cover a couple of related application concepts that can be useful for making this cycle work. And one of them is rapid prototyping. It can be really useful to spend just a little bit of time on every step as quickly as you can, so that you can identify kind of connections between these. There are strong connections between how you look at climate change, how you look at your actions, and how you think about your monitoring, right? So I typically think about this as kind of 3 cycles. One is, if you have a decision maker and you can talk to them, you do a quick kind of decision decision diagnosis. So you're going through and kind of figuring out what the decision maker thinks about that. Then you might do a rapid prototype with the decision maker and the stakeholders, and then you go back and you dig in on the steps where you need to. Next. As suggested by those benefits of rapid prototyping, not every process is going to need you to take a deep dive on every step. And doing so when you don't need to can start to burn that trust piece, as well as your time, talent, and treasure, right? So there's a need to kind of right-size the process and think about, where do you need to spend your time? Where can you do a lighter lift versus where do you have to do a really heavy lift? Next. And this idea is, I think this is a really good example from Gregor and his colleagues in the Park Service, where they looked back at 15 years of helping parks with adaptation processes and kind of organized that investment on 2 dimensions here. How decision oriented is it, and how broad is your scope? So the idea here is that if you're in the lower left, you don't need as much investment of time, talent, and treasure as you might if you were on the top right. And the same goes for the rigor of your assessments, right? And there may be some other dimensions that also fit into this, but this is a real nice summary of that investment to get the idea across. Excuse me. Next. So the last one here is about being flexible with the order of events. So Brian noted that there's recursive arrows, so did Gregor, and Gregor noted that there can be a lot of oscillation between steps 3 and 4. And it's just to reiterate that we don't explicitly put the back arrows in here, but you need to be thinking about those back arrows. And one additional thought from my experience in working with decision makers is that, it's a natural human tendency to jump to solutions. And sometimes that can be really helpful in letting folks think about, okay, what would they want to do about that? And it opens up opportunities to ask questions about, well, should we be reconsidering those management goals? And that kind of line of questioning can open up some receptiveness to going back and spending doing some hard work in steps 1 and 3. And with that, we can go to the last slide. And that brings us to the end of this presentation. Here's email addresses for the 3 of us who presented today. And you're welcome to reach out to us anytime. We'd love to talk to you. And with that, we'll open it up for question and answer.
Well, thanks very much to all of you for laying out a great discussion. Yeah, I see a lot of comments in the chat. So people were really engaged. So thank you again. We'll start with, we have about 12, 13 minutes to go through the formal part of our Q&A. We had a couple of questions in the chat. So I'm just wondering, Brian and others, if you want to still take on further discussion on the issue that Bridget raised around conservation and open standards. If anything else needs to be said briefly, that'd be good.
I can say one thing, which is that sort of agreeing with Bridget, open standards is a great basis. I think, again, fundamentally based on adaptive management. It's something that a lot of our international partners base their work on, particularly I'm thinking Canada and Australia. And in fact, last year we came out with a companion paper to this one that instead of looking from the high level down, it sort of looked from the RAD framework up. And basically made the point that RAD is a tool, not a process, and that it fits into processes. And we used 2 examples, and one of them was open standards, and the effort there was to be as general and beyond North America as we could.
Thank you. I believe, Gregory, there's a request for you to share a link on that BLM evaluation approach. So if you...
Yeah, and I see Brian's done that, which is great. Okay. Thank you, Brian.
Thanks.
And yeah, we could throw in a link for that companion paper. I'll do that as soon as I know nobody's asked me any questions I need to answer.
Yeah, and the link one I linked is that companion paper, the RAD focused one. I haven't yet dropped a link into this paper that we were describing today, but one of us will get to it here momentarily.
Yeah.
So yeah, folks can really should be able to unmute and share their video and ask questions. So please go ahead. Elizabeth, you?
I know I just dropped like an essay in the chat, but my intention was to just like keep myself on track by at least providing it in writing. But and I'm so grateful, actually, this came up from Gregor and Todd, so I was really curious if this would come up. We love the paper. It was so fun to like have a lot of our work validated, and it did like show some improvements, but we really are challenged in our process where we definitely switch steps 3 and 4. We find that the reconsidering and adjusting conservation goals before you explore strategies like just doesn't seem to work for our processes. And I actually find at least it actually works really nicely because you explore all the strategies and then you can start having those hard conversations about like what's attainable, what is possible. And then you get this like, okay, let's decide, let's revise our conservation goals if we need to. And then we decide what are those like priority actions we're going to undertake. So I'm just putting it out there. Like, well, what a radical idea. Maybe we should consider switching 3 and 4. And I will say I definitely influenced Conservation Standards version 5. They had that particular order, and I kind of, we talked through it and now it's a little more open-ended. Like, when do you edit your conservation goals? Just putting it out there and curious what you folks think about that.
Maybe I'll, thanks, Liz. Nice to see you. And by the way, I look forward to seeing your conservation science practice paper. Yeah, as for steps 3 and 4, it's interesting you flag that one. That's one we struggled with is quite the right word, but we certainly grappled with as we were writing our paper, as far as sort of where, even where is sort of the delineation, because there is so much iteration between those two steps. They're so intimately tied together that reconsideration or potential revision of goals and the identification of strategies. So, I'll just admit that perhaps it's not as clean cut as that figure might indicate, but suffice to say that I agree that they're intimately tied together. For us, that ordering made sense in sort of a hierarchical sense of like, that we got to revisit our goals first to know if we need some fundamental restructuring of everything, or it's a bit more of tweaking or sort of modifying things around the edges when we get to the strategy stage. But welcome anybody else on the team, including I think we do have a few other authors here as well if they want to throw anything in. I see Wiley's hand, so right on cue.
Thanks, Brian. And yeah, awesome to see you, Liz. Thanks for the question. I think, and we might have chatted about this before, but just to share it more broadly, I think one of the other really exciting um, uses of the kind of the back and forth between steps 3 and 4 is thinking about things spatially, right? So maybe your goal is still achievable somewhere, but it's not achievable maybe where you've been focusing your efforts in the past, right? And so our colleagues in Australia, specifically Parks Victoria, have really thought about, where on the landscape do you want to invest in resisting? Where on the landscape are you just going to have to accept? And where on the landscape can you actually move towards directing? And I think that that's a really cool way, as you said, to kind of have that iterative back and forth, right? We know we need to conserve this, special status species, but where can we do it, right? Well, we can do it here, so we're going to resist like hell in this place, right? We know we can't do it here because of invasives or whatever, so we're going to accept. And then maybe there are some places where we actually want to pursue managed relocation because we think that this species is not currently there, but it would be suitable habitat under future conditions. So I think that I totally agree that I think it's really iterative, and I just wanted to highlight that spatial thinking and application we also think is really exciting, innovative way to be kind of doing that back and forth between reconsidering goals and defining adaptation strategies and actions.
I'll just say one really quick thing to piggyback on that, which is I don't think any of us thinks this is the last word on refinements on adaptation. It's sort of maybe our best word for this point. And so, Liz, if you want to write a paper that makes a good argument for flipping 3 and 4 and why, I think that would be a great contribution. And I'll just broaden my answer and actually hit a question in the chat from Sam Reed, which is Sam asked, what about maladaptation and how to assess the negative consequences of an adaptation decision and work that in? And my answer there, the short version is, I think that fits right into that step where we evaluate and select alternatives, but we didn't call it out in our paper as far as I remember. And that's a place, Sam, where you might have a mini tool or a list of best practices or something that could really enrich the evaluation there in that step. And I would say go for it. What we hope is that to the degree this holds up under scrutiny, that this can be a platform where others can jump in. And, like we did a bit of hand waving around, hey, SDM tools apply here. I'm no SDM expert, but I'd love to see somebody really jump in on that evaluation step and bring the maximum sort of potential of SDM in there.
Since we are still on that question, since you discussed answer the question by Sam, any more thoughts on that, the maladaptation from other speakers or others?
I see in the chat that Sam says they've got a paper on exactly that. So that's awesome, Sam. Love it.
Right. Can you share that paper, Sam? Would be nice. Maybe you all read the question by Paul, but it's the comment is the world we live in a world of net ecological losses. Is it realistic to expect improvements at spatial scales that your well thought out concept would require, not to mention the temporal scales of recovery? Is there a realistic outcome here? Any net gains of consequences, or is accept the only viable option? The big, kind of a big philosophical question here.
I don't, yeah, Paul, it's maybe, well, so thanks for that. Yes, in some ways we're sort of working against decline or limiting decline as much as we can. I think realistically there will be, some winners in the climate change game, certain species, habitats, and so forth. But yeah, in aggregate, we're sort of mitigating a loss. That being said, I don't think that necessarily means accept in terms of the RAD acceptance. I think we could accept it sort of as something that is occurring around us. But as far as just accepting change across the board, I think those are sort of two different matters. I think we can strategically sure accept loss for particular places, species, processes, but I don't think it means we have to accept everywhere. I think there are places we can strategically resist or direct change to something more favorable than a complete sort of undesirable transformation. So yeah, Gregor has a hand, so maybe he's got something to throw in.
Yeah, I mean, I think anybody in adaptation probably has their own answer, or at least stab at an answer to this question. So I'll be quick here and say that, what I explain to people when I explain what I do, let's say cousins or something, I'm pretty clear that what we're dealing with is a bummer and it's not easily fixed. There's no magic wand or special magic bullet we can bring in that can make this problem go away or ensure success everywhere. But what I think about instead as an analogy is you're going rafting down a river, and the objective in the end is to get to your destination with everybody in the party still together. You may fall in the water now and then and have to pull people up. But the degree to which you keep your act together is a lot about how the people in that boat navigate the riverway, and do they all jump to the high side of the boat when it almost flips over and keep the thing intact. So it's not to say that there aren't a lot of impacts. It's not to say that in every endeavor there's going to be success, but by critically examining things that used to work that don't, rather than just continuing to invest in them, that's one way that we can find capacity to do more at scale than we otherwise might have. And I'll just end with something that a manager at Haleakala National Park told me a few years ago. This was after having spent years fighting an invasive and losing. And he said to me, I just wish we had done a more careful assessment at the beginning and we wouldn't have invested there. And I would have 1,000 worker hours to have done on anything else. And so, that's about being mindful, which is about what adaptation planning is trying to do.
And on that wonderful note, I think we can probably end the formal part of this presentation. And I know there are more questions and comments being raised, so we can discuss in that informal session. So I'll stop recording at this point, but everybody can thank our speakers again for this great session we've had. So thank you all. And if you're leaving, we hope to see you again very soon.